Now let me introduce Dr. Chen. It is very interesting how people meet with each other. Year 2016, 5 years ago, I came across Dr. Chen at a conference in New York. I was so impressed with her in-depth knowledge about China. And since then, we became very good friends. Dr. Chen was born in China, and I was born in Taiwan. So we were brought up in a very different culture. Communism versus democracy. But we are both rooted with traditional Chinese culture, and we're both proud of being a US citizen. We were determined to uphold moral values, and both of us were ashamed of CCP, the Chinese Communist Party's brutality, atrocity against humankind. I'm so thankful to have a friend to share the same values and the purpose of life. So my special thanks to Ravi for this important event, so that we can meet up in Dallas. Let's welcome Dr. Chen.
Hello everyone, I'm so honored to be here. It's really unusual for me to travel to another state to give a talk. And I guess it's also kind of strange for you to see someone flying all the way from California to speak about her personal experience. Truly, I'm so honored to be here because I work as a biologist, as some of you may have read my bio. But I'm not going to talk about any science tonight. I'm going to talk about my personal experience, growing up in China and all of these years, my family's experience. I came to the United States in 1994 as a graduate student. Actually, I spent my first year in Dallas at the UT Southwestern Medical Center. Then I transferred to California to finish my graduate school. And there was one incident in 1995 that totally changed my view towards my homeland. It was in 1995. My American friends asked me about the Tiananmen massacre. And I'm sure all of you remember the Pac-Man picture. Worldwide news reported that. And in 1995, I was still a very, very brainwashed Chinese student. I said there was no massacre. I said all over China, we watched the TV, we saw the dead bodies of soldiers, and we know that students killed soldiers. And of course, the government of China never killed any student. And then, at the same time, like when my friends told me about all the videos and the pictures about Tiananmen massacre, I said Hollywood made them. That's what my government told me. It took me 5 years to awake from this kind of propaganda. And I remember in 2001 or so, I decided that I got enough. Like for the rest of my life, I'm going to spend as much time as I can to speak on what's going on in China, just because of the information barrage, like very few Americans know what's going on there in the Chinese world. And very few Chinese dare to speak on this. And I regard this as my public service, like to contribute my knowledge to my audiences. And tonight I want to talk about the Communist Party's infiltration in the world. As I mentioned, in China, we were brainwashed not only about Tiananmen massacre, everything else we knew was censored in the news, and we were told a different story about the world. For example, North Korea, right? We were told that North Korea is a little brother of China, and they lived a wonderful life. North Korean kids, they eat 5 meals per day. They had so much food. I did not know that 10% of the population died in the big famine in the 1990s when we were told these lies. And when I told people about China, and many times the audience told me, who has time to listen about China? We're so busy. We need to deal with North Korea. We need to deal with Iran. We are busy with ISIS. Who has time to listen about China? But they may not realize, actually, we are in a battle against communism. And China is the center of this battle because behind North Korea, Iran, Cuba, ISIS, China is the center of this alliance by providing them money and technology. And for example, North Korea, China has been the major sponsor of North Korea by providing 90% of the trade with North Korea. Without China to provide the food and oil, North Korean regime will die within months. And China has been known that for providing nuclear materials to North Korea. In 2016 or so, this woman was indicted by U.S. Department of Justice for exporting nuclear material to North Korea. And she did not do that alone. In China, they have dozens of companies and banks. They work together in that building in the center of the picture. They were responsible for all this trade with North Korea. As a matter of fact, my husband used to work in one of these companies, and he had visited North Korea in the 1990s for business. And the Harbin Institute of Technology has been accepting scientists, like scholars and students from North Korea, and train them on nuclear technology. And that's how North Korea was able to develop all this technology. And China has been famous for selling US technology to Iran. For example, ZTE in 2017 was punished for exporting US technology to Iran, and Huawei did the same. And I'm not going to go through more details about this. Also, many people ask me, okay, what's wrong with the Communist Party? They're doing great in China. Why not that Communist Party take over the world? Maybe the US will live a better life. But in reality, the Communist Party has a long history of human rights abuses. My parents' generation survived the Great Famine in the 1950s. That's when the Communist Party said, okay, it's communism, everyone should submit food to the government, and we're going to distribute them equally. Everyone gets the same share. But they did not distribute them. About 30 to 40 million Chinese died from starvation. And it's still a taboo in China. People were not allowed to talk about the Great Famine in China. The Chinese government said it's a natural disaster, but nobody knew what kind of natural disaster happened at that time. It's purely human mistake. And my parents' generation also suffered from the Great Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and 1970s. That's when the Communist Party went to extreme. They said any education can give people independent thinking. Then they can criticize the government. So they decided to shut down the whole education system in China for 10 years. There was no school in China for 10 years. And millions of pieces of antiques and all the ancient buildings were destroyed, and over 2 million intellectuals were killed or persecuted. They either died from persecution or they committed suicide. And that didn't end there. In 1989, the second generation leader, Deng Xiaoping, started the Tiananmen massacre. He killed over 10,000 Beijing citizens and students just because they protested on Tiananmen Square asking for democracy. And that is also a taboo in China now. Nobody are allowed to talk about it. And that did not end. Just 10 years later, Jiang Zemin, the third generation leader of the Communist Party, started the persecution towards Falun Gong. This is a Chinese meditation, body-and-mind practice, rooted on traditional Chinese culture, with the principle truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. Falun Gong has been famous for its health benefits, and is always taught for free because according to the teachings, nobody should make profit from that. And it's one of the most popular meditation all over the world. And in China, it's estimated about 17 million Chinese practice Falun Gong. The Chinese government not only detained millions of Falun Gong practitioners and killed many of them, they also used their organs for transplant. In the US, people typically wait for 3 years for organ donors. But in China, they can get it within 24 hours. Because the Chinese government have millions of Falun Gong, Uyghurs, and Christians in detention camps. All of them were blood type tested and ready to be killed, to be sold their organs, to sell their organs to the patients. And I'm not going to go through more details about that because I think you've got flyers on your table, and outside at the entrance there's a table of Falun Gong. They have their little lotus flowers and the flyers there. You can talk to them after the meeting to know more about this persecution that's currently happening in China. And the Communist Party is able to kill so many Chinese people and maintain their authority because they have been very successful in brainwashing Chinese people. The Chinese government controls every media in China. And they also censor every book, every art pieces, every film, and also their social media. Everything circulating in China had to go through censorship. And actually China had this censorship department to go through everything. And foreign media, like Hollywood films, are not allowed to enter China. They also need to be censored. I think each year they only allow about 12 films to be shown in China. And all these films, they have to be adapted according to the needs of the Communist Party. And internet in China, you can call it intranet instead of internet because they're blocked from outside world. The Great Firewall on the internet of China blocked all the social media in Western world. In China, you cannot read anything on Facebook, Twitter, you cannot watch YouTube. And there are over 2 million internet police trained by the Communist Party. So if you post something on internet, Chinese internet, something sensitive, or if you want to search on the internet about a Tiananmen massacre, within 1 hour, they're going to trace down your IP and knock at your door. They're very, very efficient at that, in that. And surveillance in communist China is beyond your imagination. China is the biggest surveillance country in the world. Neighborhood committee. Think about neighborhood committee in the US. They're very friendly, they organize events, they make everything happy. But in China, neighborhood committee has a different definition. Their job is to monitor every household in the block. See, what are you doing there at home? Are you more practicing Falun Gong? Then you're doing meditation, they're going to report you to the police. If you have some friends visiting, they'll figure out, have you been in contact with any dissidents? Like if you're in contact with some dissidents, like they're also going to report you to the police. And the Communist Party chapter is required in every company, every school and every organization, including Western companies like Disney. They are required to sponsor a Communist Party chapter, and the company must pay for the cost, and they must allow at least 1 Communist Party member to sit in their board meetings. And China has over 200 million surveillance cameras installed already across the country, but the government says that's not enough. Their plans, like before next year, they want to have at least 1 surveillance camera covering 2 Chinese people. And they install surveillance cameras not only on the street, they also install them in school classrooms. They want to monitor what teachers are teaching so that they can come back to catch the teachers if they taught something wrong. And hardware is made in China. We have to be very careful about that because almost every hardware made in China, from cell phone to laptops, they would capture all the information you enter them and send the data to China, and including hardware sold in the US. For example, I would never use any cell phone or computer made in China because they would collect all the information and send them to the Chinese companies. And China passed the International Intelligence Law in 2017 that requires every company to submit data to the government whenever they're asked to. It's a law. So whenever you have a Chinese company running, collecting your data, don't trust what they tell you because they're not allowed to hide their data from the government. Whenever the Chinese government wants it, they must submit it, otherwise they break the Chinese law. And Communist Party consulates all over the world has been acting as a spy hubs. So their primary duty is to monitor the activities of Chinese Americans to find out who in the community is criticizing the government. Like as any Chinese citizen or any Chinese American, for example, you may need to go back to China, you may need to get a visa, or if you're a Chinese citizen living here on green card, you may need to renew your passport. And then they have the incentive to threaten you, not to criticize about human rights in China, otherwise they can cancel your passport or deny your visa. And they also force some Chinese Americans to act as their spies because they have control of them, like otherwise they cannot go back to China. Or they can lure them to go to business trips in China. They not only lure Chinese Americans to these red carpet trips, but also elected officials in the US. Once they go to China, get this treatment, they sometimes fall into honey traps, and then the Chinese government can control them and have them act as agents for the Chinese government. Although they are US citizens, they are acting as spies for the Chinese government in the US. And the steal of intellectual property is everywhere. And I want to focus on the Southern Talents Program. And Chinese government has a long history of recruiting Chinese Americans, successful Chinese Americans, go back to China and to take your knowledge back. They say you need to serve your mother country. So in the 1950s, many successful Chinese Americans went back to China and brought world-leading technologies. That was how China was able to have this nuclear technology, all this great progress on technology in the 1950s. But then later in the 1960s, during the Cultural Revolution, most of these Chinese Americans, they were persecuted, and many of them died during the Cultural Revolution maybe because the government saw they're useless, and then they were ditched. But they're still doing it now. Like the Southern Talents Program run by the Chinese government recruit the most successful Americans, or in other Western countries, to build shadow labs in China. So for example, the US government has been sponsoring many world-leading research projects. And these researchers, they are recruited to go back to China to build up shadow labs. Whatever they do in the US, they copy it in China. That's one of the major ways for the Chinese government to steal the technology. And they also actually send spies, excuse me, as students or visiting scholars to top research labs in the US. And I will not go through more details on this because of time limit. And the US media and education system and also Hollywood has been heavily infiltrated by the Chinese government. Do you remember, if you ever read the Washington Post, you may have noticed that they have this insertion called China Watch. You may think, oh, it's a blog run by the Chinese, by Washington Post, but actually they are paid ads by the Chinese government. And the Chinese government has been paying ads on at least 30 mainstream newspapers worldwide. New York Times, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, LA Times, and they pay for the advertisement. But these advertisements do not look like advertisement. This is one example of LA Times last year on April 29th. They had, LA Times, that particular issue had 38 pages. And 11 pages of them were paid ads by the Chinese government called International Daily. They just look like any other article in LA Times. But all these articles highly praise the Communist Party on how they deal with coronavirus, how great they are in taking care of their people. And when people read that, they say, LA Times said China is doing a great job, and China must have been doing a great job. And the US just started to take action against the media infiltration by labeling some Chinese media as foreign missions, and I think the list can go much longer than that. And in the universities, any scholars studying Chinese history face a dilemma. If they speak the truth about the Chinese history, about the truth about how the Communist Party killed intellectuals during the Cultural Revolution or the Great Famine, they have big trouble because if they ever visited China, they can be arrested for that. And some professors were already arrested and took our Congress a great hassle to bring him back. And most of these researchers, they chose to leave the field, or they can lie. They can say something pro-Communist Party. Then they can get red carpet treatment if they go to China. And they may even get fundings for that. And these kind of differential treatment cause a long-term, but very subtle, but very long-term self-censorship among American scholars. It takes great courage to speak the truth. And publishers, we are talking about scientific journals, political science journals, and they are pressured by the Chinese government to remove contents that Beijing does not want. For example, Cambridge Press in 2017 agreed to remove several hundred articles because Beijing said if you don't remove these articles, you cannot access Chinese market. So the Cambridge removed those articles, but of course later on people started to protest. And some of these publishers put the articles back. And Confucius Institute is a free Chinese program operated by the Chinese government in over 100 universities in the US and more than 500 high schools. But don't be confused by the name. They don't teach Confucianism. They teach Communist Party's version of history. You cannot teach anything about Tiananmen, Tibet, or Taiwan there. And teachers must sign a contract that they cannot practice Falun Gong. And oftentimes in local universities, like University of Maryland, Confucius Institute blocks the university from inviting Dalai Lama to come to give a commencement speech. And on the website of Confucius Institute, people discovered this video program about history, about Korean War. It said in Chinese that Americans started the Korean War because Americans wanted to invade North Korea, they invaded China. That was exactly what I learned about the Korean War when I was a student in China. But we're talking about Stanford University. We're talking about UCLA, all these top universities in the US. We pay tens of thousands of dollars for our children and grandchildren to go to these top universities. We're so proud of the education they get. Then the university outsourced the Chinese teaching to their local Confucius Institute, and then these students get brainwashed by the Chinese government. And the US just started to take actions against Confucius, the infiltration to the Chinese academic system, to the US academic system, by labeling it as a foreign mission and stopped giving fundings to universities running Confucius Institute. So a university, they choose to run Confucius Institute, they cannot get federal funding to sponsor their Chinese programs. And because of that, about 40% of Confucius Institutes already closed. But we need continuous effort until every one of them closed in the US. And China has been actively buying Hollywood. AMC Theater is the biggest cinema chain in the US. It was bought by a Chinese company, Dalian Wanda, in 2012. The same company bought Carmichael Theaters, is another big cinema chain. They also bought Legendary Entertainment. Remember the film Jurassic Park? That's a filmmaking company for Jurassic Park. But once this entertainment industry belongs to a Chinese mother company, they must follow Chinese government's rule about what kind of film they can make and what kind of film they can show. Think about it, in Hollywood, when was the last time you saw a film about human rights in China? Very few of them has guts to say anything about this. And oftentimes in a Hollywood film, you will say someone went to Mars and cannot come back, and then the Chinese government sent a space shuttle to rescue them. And these kind of subtle, very subtle elements gradually planted this ideology in the mind of Americans in their entertainment programs. Say, hey, China is doing great. Like Chinese people, they are friends of us. Chinese government, they are friends of us. They can come to rescue Americans when we are in trouble. And unfortunately, we haven't done much in Hollywood. And at the same time, the infiltration to the US government, more and more are exposed recently. And oftentimes, Chinese government have been supporting their favorite candidates through local Chinese American organizations. For example, as I mentioned in my previous speech, like in my previous slides, if you're Chinese American, oftentimes you want to go to China to do business, to visit friends, to visit your family, and then the Chinese government can give you pressure, say, hey, you want to go back to China, you want to renew your passport or get a visa, you'd better endorse that candidate. And they also hire top PR firms, public relations firms, and retired US government officials to lobby for the Chinese government. For example, one of the former California US Senator, Barbara Boxer, now works as a lobbyist for one of the top Chinese companies. And they also invite officials to China for red carpet treatment. And I visit Washington, D.C. every summer to meet my elected officials and talk to them and urge them to take actions on human rights in China. And we noticed that some elected officials, after they went to these kind of trips to China, they don't want to meet us anymore. And that's very typical. And I remember a few years ago, we saw this big news about Dianne Feinstein, the California's federal Senate. One of his drivers, they said he worked for Dianne Feinstein for 20 years. He turned out to be a Chinese spy. Do you believe for 20 years Dianne Feinstein was never influenced by this spy? Nobody would believe that. And one real example, in 2017, California tried to pass a statewide resolution condemning organ harvesting in China. And before that resolution was voted, the Chinese consulate in San Francisco called the Senate president. They also sent one email to every Senate members urging them to block that resolution. And the Senate block that resolution. That was just one example. The Chinese consulate can send emails, make phone calls to our elected officials and tell them what to do. And some elected officials would do that. And now talk about internationally, like how about United Nations? Like say, hey, United Nations must be good, right? Now I want to mention about China's Belt and Road project. It sounds like a great project. China approached all these developing countries who have economic problems, saying, hey, we're going to come to help you. We're going to build this luxurious airport for you. Don't worry about the money. We're going to give you a loan. You can pay us later. And oftentimes, they would bribe the elected officials of these countries. They send money to their personal account, and then these officials will sign contract, and then the project will go on. And then after the project is done, the country will say, uh-oh, the bill is so big, like we can't pay for the loan. What are we going to do? And China will say, oh, don't worry, just let us use your airport or this infrastructure for 99 years. Actually, Sri Lanka lost one of its most important ports to China because it cannot pay for the Belt and Road loan. And because of this, China is able to expand its military influence all over the world. And they are also able to control, the United Nations. Let me see, how can I go back to the previous slides? Okay, it's okay. So, as we mentioned, like in my previous slides, like United Nations, the rule of United Nations, like every country has one vote. Just think about the Belt and Road project. They already control more than 150 countries, and most of these countries would vote according to the need of China. So under United Nations, there are 15 agents, and China already lead 4 of them. And in the other 11 agents of the United Nations, China also hold important positions. Think about the World Health Organization, WHO. Think about their bizarre behavior during the pandemic. They just copied every word Chinese government told them to. They never did any independent investigation. Why? Because the leader of WHO was from Ethiopia, and that's one of the allies of China in the Belt and Road project. So it's not difficult to explain that United Nations, they will not take any serious action. Like anything that the Chinese government do not like, they will not take any action against the Chinese government. And now we talk about like a Communist Party. How come they have gained so much power? And they're powered by trade. Without the money, they would not have been able to do so. For decades, American business owners, they went to China to do business. They have this naive thinking, say, once we start to trade with China, automatically the communists would embrace freedom, embrace democracy. I'm sorry, that was so naive. It did not happen. China used slave labor and cheap labor. So you can imagine, Chinese people only got a small percentage of benefits from the trade. The Communist Party took the most benefit. And that's why they had so much money to monitor Chinese, to come back, to buy our media, to buy our university, to buy Hollywood, to buy the Americans. And through this process, they also have this intellectual property theft, because whenever Western companies do business in China, Chinese government control the market. They say, you want a Chinese market? Yes, give us your technology so that you can enter the market. And after these American Western companies gave technology to China, the government immediately gave the competitors in China. And eventually, these Western companies were driven out of the market. And that happened to Cisco, to Yahoo, to many Western companies. Eventually, they will have to leave the market. And Western companies in China, on human rights, they did not perform a good role. Cisco helped the Chinese government to build the Great Firewall Internet. And Yahoo gave their users email contents to the Chinese police. They said, hey, we have to follow Chinese government's rule if we do business in China. And quite a few Chinese reporters, they trusted Yahoo mails. So they used the Yahoo email to discuss the policy of Chinese government, how the Chinese government blocks them from reporting Tiananmen massacre related events. And these reporters, because Yahoo gave away their contents, they were sentenced to 80 years, 10 years in prison because of Yahoo. Although the Communist Party is actively expanding its influence all over the world, back in China, they are still starting to have trouble. Ever since the Communist Party took over China, they had no problem wiping out anyone within 3 months because Chinese people were already used to remain silent towards injustice. They said, hey, nobody can say no to the Communist Party, let's just remain silent, just protect ourselves. But the Falun Gong was an exception because this is a group follow the principle of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. According to their teachings, they must speak out when they see injustice. Between 1999 and 2001, Falun Gong practitioners, they went to public to protest all over China. They hold their little banners that truthfulness, compassion, tolerance, asking for their rights to meditate. That thing, lasting for 2 years, shocked the Chinese society. Everyone said, wow, Falun Gong, they're so brave. They protest, they say no to the Communist Party just for their rights to meditate. And how come we cannot protest for our rights? Nowadays, if you visited China, you see thousands of different groups protesting for their rights. But Falun Gong went underground in 2001. They started to print flyers and make DVDs at home and distribute to their neighbors and talk to their friends and families and awake them from propaganda. And outside of China, in US, in Canada, in Europe, there are quite a few Falun Gong practitioners who are also computer scientists. They formed 3 major companies to write free softwares to help Chinese people to bypass the Great Firewall on the internet. And they have been having constant competition with the Chinese Communist Party regime. Nowadays, about 30% of internet users in China regularly use these softwares to bypass Great Firewall to find out what's happening in the world and what's happening in China. And that started the great human rights movement in China. China started to have human rights lawyers. People started to sign petitions to support victims. But what encouraged me the most is the trend of quitting the Communist Party. Communist Party runs like a mafia. They would identify the best students, the best teacher, the most successful business owners. They recruit you to join. And then you cannot say no. If you say no, you have big trouble. And once you join the party, you must pay for the fee. You must join all the activities of the Communist Party to persecute your fellow Chinese. And you cannot quit. If you quit, you have big trouble. So in 2004, some volunteers in San Diego, California, started a website that allowed Chinese people to send their statements via internet, of course, through these VPNs to bypass the Great Firewall. They can post these statements on this website, say, I want to quit the Communist Party. I want to quit the youth league of the Communist Party. That's for the high schoolers. Or I want to quit the young pioneers of the Communist Party. That's for middle schoolers and elementary students. And then they get a digital certificate for quitting the Communist Party with a unique serial number belonging to them. And this unique certificate for each individual is recognized by the US government as an official document of quitting the Communist Party. I became a US citizen in 2013. When I was naturalized, I had to answer a standard question. Everyone must answer this question. Have you ever joined a Nazi, ISIS, or Communist Party? If the answer were yes, I cannot be a US citizen, then I can submit this digital certificate to say, hey, I quit the party from this website. And the immigration office recognizes as an official document of quitting the party. And on this website, I just tracked 2 days ago, about 317 million Chinese people already quit the Communist Party and its affiliate organizations. And I found that really encouraging because when Soviet Union collapsed, people say, hey, miracle. Sorry, it's not a miracle. For decades, people there have been abandoning communism. And that's why you see the change overnight. And we are seeing the same thing happening in China. And I believe that the human rights movement is bringing China to a great future and also bring the world to the great future. But we need to support them in the US to take actions. And I want to mention about the 2 resolutions that the state of Texas is working on. And I heard from Shirley that the state Senate resolution was just passed today unanimously, condemning forced organ harvesting in China. And the House will also have a similar solution coming soon. And all of you, every individual of you, can take your action to talk to your elected officials. And I'm so honored to be here today to speak to all of you. As I mentioned, I'm nobody. I'm just myself. I'm a concerned Chinese American. I do not affiliate to any organization. I just fly here to see my friend Shirley, and I'm so happy to stay with Rabi. And I believe every one of us can take action to stop these atrocities in China. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chen. An enormous speech, very powerful. Thank you.